Hey everybody, I'm here today with Jerry Vorhies, who is a current producer in the game industry with a background in digital art and QA. How you doing today, Jerry?
I'm good, Connor. How are you?
I'm good. I know that before the recording started, we talked a little bit about your Lego in the background, and I just wanted to point that out to everybody watching.
Yeah.
I said it was like a museum back there. It's really cool, and you've amassed that over the years, right? This is something that you've been building over a long time.
Yeah, 25 years. I bought the very first set when I worked at Target in the toy department and just right out of high school pretty much. And after you buy the first one, you have to buy the second one, right? So
Yeah. It
yeah.
just kept going and going. Do you have any like still in their boxes or anything? Any sets that you never got around to building?
Yeah, I have several actually. We've got like a
Yeah.
closet of unbuilt sets. And throughout the house is kind of like a museum. We've got the city sets and we have Ninjago and we've got like Back to the Future and Ghostbusters and Voltron and Transformers and all the different other little sets, the Mario sets they've released throughout the whole house. So people come over and they're like, "Are you charging for this? Because it's like a museum, you should be charging for tickets." So,
Awesome. Well,
yeah.
we could talk about Lego all day, but I'm gonna jump into your questions here. So, um, you started working in the game industry in 1995 for Square Enix. How did you kind of find yourself entering the video game industry? Was it something that you had always wanted to do, or did you just kind of stumble into it? How'd you find yourself at Square
Yeah.
Enix?
So back in 1985, Nintendo released their first system, and I had already had an Atari that I got at a garage sale. And I remember being so excited for that very first system when it came out as a kid, and became a teenager, got the Super Nintendo. I was never a big Sega fan, but I always liked some of the Sega games, but I couldn't afford both systems. So I was really a Nintendo boy. And then I think I was in 10th grade, and my mom and I was just like a single mom. We were living down in Southern California. And I just remember one day I went in and I was just got home from school and I said, "Mom, I'm moving to Redmond, Washington to work for Nintendo, and I'm going to go with or without you, and I'm leaving in like now." So uh, we moved around a lot as a kid, so it wasn't like a big deal. So my mom was like, "Okay, I guess we're going to Redmond." So we picked up and we left for Redmond when I was in 10th grade, so I could work for Nintendo, which was crazy. But I remember back then you could call Nintendo their 1-800 number line, and you could get a live person pretty easy and just talk. And I remember one day, this was before I actually worked with this guy. I worked with Eli Wolf in the game industry. And at the time, he was a Nintendo counselor. And I talked with him several times when I'd call. And he's like, "Yeah, Redmond's a great place. Just come on in." And this is the 90s, so it was very different. They still had like two stoplights in all of Redmond. Now it's like crazy because of Microsoft. But anyway, we moved up here and I started calling around even in high school. And I loved Final Fantasy, which I found out Squaresoft, this was before they merged with Enix, was in Redmond. And so I sent them a letter one day when I had found out that Final Fantasy V for the Super Nintendo, they were going to release it. And I was so excited. And then they said, "We're not going to release it, even though it's completely translated, it's ready to go." And I was just appalled. I was like, "I'm so excited for this game and it's not going to come out." So I went to high school and I had a petition, and I had all these high schoolers in my high school sign this petition. I had like 400 names on this petition that were all signed. I had cheerleaders, I had jocks, I had everybody signing this thing saying, "If you release Final Fantasy V, we will buy it." And so I took this love letter, I snail mailed it across the street to Squaresoft, and I said, "Hey, look, there's all these people that would love to play this game." And I think it was Ted Woolsey from Square. He called me and he said, "Hey, would you be interested in playtesting this game we've got right now going over the summer? And you can work here as a summer internship." And of course, going in out of 10th grade into 11th grade over the summer, you're going, "Of course I want to work on video games on my summer vacation, right?" So that's when I pulled in and I got pulled in for Chrono Trigger. And that's kind of how I made things kind of happen. You just make phone calls back then. The 90s is very different. There weren't people lined up around the block to make video games like there are now. So they were like, "Hey, great, we've got a tester. That's amazing." And that's how I got my foot in the door initially and moved up into the area to actually make video games.
Yeah, that's really cool. I mean, like you said, you could just call back then, and now you've got people at the door. Would you say it's harder to do something like that nowadays to be able to just call or mail something to someone and get your into an industry that way.
Yeah, I think. See, I actually have recommended that to people lately. I'm like, if you
Yeah.
really want to be noticed, like show up like as a pizza delivery person and just hand them your resume, you know. It shows initiative, I think, and it depends on, where you're at and what studio it is. Is it fully remote? Is it local? Is it just down the street from you? That kind of thing, obviously. But there's something to be said about human connection and that drive. For me, I think back then, that story of, hey, this kid came all the way from Southern California, with basically a shirt on his back and convinced his mom and all these kinds of things, yada, yada. He's calling us on the phone. That's a big initiative for someone that's still in 10th grade. That's determination. But, you fast forward now to 2025, and we have game colleges, which we didn't have back then, where you've got these classes of folks that are graduating every single year and they're adding to this already large inflated talent pool. While at the meantime, we've got studios that are collapsing, and people are out on the street that have AAA experience, or years of experience, and you've got people coming right out of school creating this big challenge. So now you've got people lined up around the block. We've got offshoring of a lot of different jobs that we normally would have had here, because it's cheaper. So now we've got folks here. So it creates this whole new dilemma and this whole thing. But back then you could call somebody. I think that's how I got my job at Enix later as a tester. I called them and I said, "Hey, do you have any jobs for testing?" And they're like, "Actually, we do. Come on in, we'll give you an interview." And they interviewed me, and I was hired like a couple days later. Just not like that today.
Yeah. Cool. So, after that internship and then getting your first, or even with that internship and then, you know, actually getting in as, a full-time person, what were some initial challenges or struggles that you faced, if any, and how did you overcome them?
Some of the initial struggles, I think when I actually wanted I initially came up here to work in art. I wanted to be a digital artist. I wanted to do art. So the QA jobs kind of just happened, and they were a little bit easier. I think QA is a good way. Even today, QA is a better way to kind of get your foot in the door. That's not to say it's an easy job. It's not. It's actually a really hard job, I think, and that's one reason why people want to do the more illustrious jobs, art and production and blah blah blah. But when I did want to look for art, I had to put a portfolio together of everything I could do. And back then, we didn't have email like we have now and websites. So when you sent a portfolio off, you would have 8.5 by 11 color copies and a printed thing that you sent that usually cost you about 15 to $20 in color copies to send plus postage. And I was applying everywhere, and I couldn't afford to print my portfolio out all the time. It was expensive. It was hard to find even current addresses for some of the game studios that were local because you didn't have a full, robust internet with all the latest information, right? So that was a big challenge to find a spot as an artist. And finally, somebody saw my portfolio. They had a friend in the industry, and they showed it to this producer. And that's kind of how I was able to get in. But the challenge back then was, you didn't have everything at your fingertips. So while that is opening, I think, a lot of doors for people today, where we're lining up around the block to get a job, so to speak, like we were talking about, we had kind of an opposite problem where people couldn't line up around the door because they had to do research to find out where you could apply, and you had to have that drive to really kind of, I think, get there back then. But for me, entering the space as an artist back then, you didn't have a lot of options for self-teaching. As far as like YouTube and things like that were still in their infancy. And if you could find a tutorial on something on, 3D Studio Max or Maya or Photoshop, it was usually something more basic and tools related rather than specialized. So self-teaching was, I think, a little bit harder back then too. So as a new platform would come out and, things would get more complicated and we would get more technical and things like that. Back then, we had to really learn on our own. We couldn't look it up on the internet. We couldn't have a YouTube kind of video. It made it more challenging back then. You had to really sit and figure things out. And I think our teams worked a little bit more closely together back then, with information sharing. We had to, because that was the only way you learned, especially in the game industry. because we had certain ways of doing things because of limitations. So, you hear about like palette limitations and poly limitations and all those kinds of things. Um, a lot of that knowledge was kind of internal to our studios, and different studios kind of had different ways of doing things. So all that knowledge was kind of internal versus everything you could just like find out on the internet today.
Would you, even though there's like a lot more resources on the internet, nowadays, would you say that the trade-off is that now it's more competitive to get into these jobs?
Yeah, it's a lot more competitive. I think back then you kind of didn't necessarily need to have a degree or go to school, but it definitely helped to have a lot of those kinds of things. Like if you had a computer animation degree, that could apply in multiple directions. Multimedia, you could go to Hollywood and work on cartoon films, or you could work in the game industry. Now it's way more specialized, right? And today, you don't necessarily have to go to school to learn a lot of that stuff. You can just like work in indie games. You can watch YouTube videos. You can like self-teaching, and with all these free kind of software things that you can learn on now, you can create something in your portfolio that's very robust without spending hundreds of thousands of dollars and going to, these game colleges, which I I do recommend if you can afford it. It's a great experience. You meet a lot of people, all those kinds of things. So I'm not bad mouthing the game colleges. I think they're totally worth it. But they are expensive. But I think today, fast forward today, we have a lot more options to self-learn and things like that, where back then you didn't. So yeah, obviously, I think it's making it a lot easier to get in the game industry as far as tools. But now that you've got so many people that can learn those tools, the pool itself is making it more challenging.
Sure. So, since starting in the industry, you worked in quality assurance starting off, then you got into digital art. You worked in production as a producer and a senior producer, and you were a creative lead on a few projects as well. You know, how did these roles differ from one another? And have you found yourself gravitating towards one thing or another? I know that you said that when you entered the industry, you originally wanted to try to get into digital art, but did you find yourself liking production more or maybe liking QA more?
Yeah, so let's see. I think as far as like the differences between the roles, um, QA was monotonous, but it could be a lot of fun. But you'd also at the same time, you'd get a new version of the game that you've been working on for a month, come back in. Every time you get a new version, we'd have to start from the beginning and work through it over and over and over again. And it could be challenging, especially if it's a game like I worked on Valkyrie Profile. And if you've played that game, it is basically about uh, this whole army that you build with these character introductions where they basically are dying. They're a human and they're coming to, I think it was Valhalla, wherever, like, into Odin's realm. And they basically die. You see their death scene, and it's introducing all these characters through the gameplay. And I remember every day it was like we kind of joke. It's like, did you bring the antidepressants? Because every day was like another day of watching these characters die and their voiceovers. And back then, having voiceovers in a game was still pretty rare. And the artwork was beautiful. So, you're sitting there and you're just watching death after death after death. You know, so QA can be a little bit depressing, especially when you're having to redo it. And at the same time, we did a game called Bust a Groove 2, which was a fighting game, but it was a dance game. And it was like a button remembering kind of game where you had to do like the button combinations. So I remember getting really good at that, where you could like do all the button combinations. And I'd have people down at EA come up to our booth when we were down there, and they had played the first game and they'd go, well, okay, well, you're the tester, so you should be really good at this, but I'm going to warn you, I'm a pro. And I'm like, okay, so let's play. And I was trying to be nice, but I took this pro guy and basically owned him. And I just realized that, as a tester, when you do it 40 hours a week, month after month, it's monotonous and it can be fun, but it's not an easy job. But I think, again, like I was saying earlier, that's why a lot of people don't want to do it. They want to try and be an artist or something else. But it's a good way to get your foot in the door and learn the business because as a QA tester, you typically as a tester, you don't necessarily work with everybody, but as a lead, you would. You work with artists and you work with the developers and you learn the processes. And even as a regular tester, you're working with your lead and you're learning the baseline of how games are produced, right? So I think coming in as QA like you and I did was a great start. But moving into artwork, it's a completely different world where, you start in pre-production and you're creating, I guess, like the concepts. What do we want to do for this game? How much time do we have? Are we working on a known, IP, intellectual property for like Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings, or is this a brand new thing that's never been done before? Uh, and if you are and you are working on an IP as an artist, that's a big challenge because you have to follow a certain guideline of rules that are set before you. I remember my very first art job, I got pulled in from that portfolio I was telling you that I sent out. I had an art test and they said, hey, we can't tell you what you would be working on, but here's some basic sketches. Can you put them into your style and submit them by tomorrow? So I did these art for these witches and wizards, and I didn't know what it was at the time. I submitted it, and he wrote me back and he said, "Hey, we've talked on the phone. I feel comfortable. I want to bring you in next week. I can't tell you what you're working on until you sign an NDA, but I would highly recommend you read the first Harry Potter book." So the following week, I got pulled into the office, and I'm surrounded by Harry Potter stuff. And they say you're going to be doing the portraits and the witches and wizard cards for the first Harry Potter game on Game Boy Color. And I was blown away. I didn't know too much about it. The first book had come out, the second book was almost coming out, and they were getting ready to make the first movie. And so it was still a pretty new thing. It wasn't as big a deal back then as it is today. Um, but I felt honored to work on something like that. It felt really cool. But the challenge was I would do these sketches of Harry and Hermione based off these movie photos and what I had read from the book. So there wasn't a lot that I had to go on. I hadn't seen the first movie. Most of the characters, all I had was like one crappy image from the movie set where they took a photo of them. And the
Yeah.
rest of the 101 Witches cards was just a one-line description. And these names, like some of the names, you're like, is this a woman, a man? Like, I don't know who this is, So you're like having to come up with all these unique things for this video game. And I get feedback from J.K. Rowling. The scar needs to go in the center. The scar needs to go on the side. Can you move his glasses up? His glasses aren't square, they're round. Can you blah, 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 blah. And I remember going through this, and we're talking like pixels, like 32 by 32 or 16 by 16 pixels. So then they'd say, do this, you're like changing the color of a pixel, not moving a pixel, you're changing the color to change the shape from far away, right? And just back and forth. And so EA would have a say in something, then JK would have a say in something. My art director would have a say in something. And so I'm constantly changing art assets. And as an artist, that's something in the industry that we would have to deal with over and over and over on these projects. So I would say for anybody who's wanting to be an artist in the game industry, you got to have a really thick skin because it's not just a matter of feeling like your artwork is not good enough, which it's not that it's not good enough, it's that the style that you're doing it in is either not the style they want or it's not quite what they want from a look perspective, like the scar moving or, I remember Rowena Ravenclaw. I thought Rowena was a guy, so I gave this witch this great big beard, and JK came back and said it's a woman, so can you get rid of the beard? And so I got rid of the beard. All I did was just shave a few pixels off and I was done. So, um, but I think working on artwork like that, project after project, we worked on Lord of the Rings and some Star Wars stuff. We worked on a lot of different IPs and I did artwork for all kinds of stuff. And back then on handheld games, we had a really tight deadline because either the movie was coming out or it was handheld, and handheld back then was moving a lot more quickly than like, the Switch has lasted, I think, 12 years now or something. But back then we had, Game Boy Color, GD, it was just like boom, 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 all these new things. So it was always rolling into something new. So we had to hurry these projects out. And I'd get put from one project to another at this one studio I was at for 7 years under different producers. They'd put a team together and they'd break us up and put us into other teams. And every time that happened, we were on a new deadline. We were on a new schedule. I was with a new producer. And I'd get put back with different producers sometimes. And I had my favorite producer I liked working with. And eventually I realized we're going on death marches. Some of these projects we're working 80 hours a week. And at one point, I don't want to say the name of the project, then we get in trouble, but all hell broke loose. We had approval for a certain way that the game looked, and we did that. It was approved, it was stamped, we did it, the whole game. We had like I think 3 months left to finish this really big project. And the art director from the main studio that we were working with came back and said, "We want to change the perspective of the game. So we don't want just like a straight top down. We want kind of like this funky fishbowl isometric kind of view." We had done all the environments in pixel art with what we called chars, like tile sets. The whole game was pretty much done. Almost all the backgrounds were done. And by changing that, it meant going through and redoing everything, like almost all the backgrounds from the ground up. And I think we'd already spent like 4 or 5 months on the game, and we were in a really good spot. Now we had 3 months to fix everything per our contract because they had a contract that said they could change things at any given point in time. And so we worked almost nonstop for 3 months without a day off, anywhere from 12 to 15 hours a day to fix this artwork. And it was absolute hell. Um, and I just remember thinking, this isn't the first project I've been on that has gone sideways. And most of the time, from those experiences, it came down to bad leadership. It came down to the producer or somebody agreeing to something that they knew the team couldn't do without killing themselves. And I had been interested a little bit in working with people. I enjoyed working with people. I enjoyed collaborations on the team and things like that, and had been working with my favorite producer on and off, with game design documents and pitches and schedules. And he was asking me about, my art assets and things like that. Hey, could you create a list and a schedule and a timeline for all that? And at that point, I had kind of become like an art lead where I was working on some other separate projects and things like that. And I found myself thinking, I really want to protect my team. I really want to protect them from these horrible death march experiences. I want to protect them from bad leadership. I want to protect them from all these things that are causing me to hate my job. And, we're making video games. It should not be, I hate my job. We're making video games. It should be, I love my job. This is fun. And I want to be here for it. And I started thinking, hey, I'm kind of, as an art lead on these handheld projects, the polygons and the technology for next gen systems was taking off. And I was getting at a point where I was sort of pigeonholed into these pixel art type of art scenarios and low poly type things where I didn't have a lot of time back then to sit and do research on a lot of the newest stuff. And I found myself kind of going, well, I'm at a crossroads. I can continue to work on this production stuff, or I can try and pursue this thing in art. And I thought I really enjoy working with people and I really enjoy working with schedules. I love artwork. Like I've actually recently thought about going back and learning, to do some more of this more modern art now that there's, tools available and videos to go back and do it. But I ended up getting a certification in project management through the PMI, and I decided to follow that. And so eventually I got my first job over at Microsoft on Forza, where I was actually working with artists as an art producer. So it was kind of like a natural transition for me. And uh, that was amazing, a great experience. But it was funny because I was considered an associate producer, like an entry-level producer. But I look back now at the work that I was doing for that, and it was a full-fledged production producer, like even a senior producer experience. I was in charge of 40 artists. I remember 40 artists, five art leads, 18 different tracks, four external vendors that were all doing hundreds of assets. And I was working very closely with the art lead for all of that as well. So the two of us were kind of like a pair where we were both handling all this, but it was a ton of overhead. It was constant communication, constant updates, constantly changing things. Um, and going from an art role to a producer role, it was kind of a natural transition for me because when I remember doing art, like art lead stuff, I was doing almost some stuff that like producers were asking for that they would do as well. So it wasn't like a big jump for me, but I think for a lot of folks who want to become a producer who are either in development or, as an artist and they're looking, hey, I want to be a producer someday. Um, if you can work as an art lead or a dev lead and you start building your schedules and doing some of the work that a producer would do, it's kind of an easier transition, I think. Learning to do even bug burn downs and, all those kinds of things that a producer does. If you work with your team on those kinds of things, it can be an easier transition. But I think the difference between being a developer and artist versus a producer is you have to have people skills. And it's not just hard skills. As a developer, you're writing code, or even a designer. I've worked with some designers who have no people skills at all, and it can be really tough, right? But as a producer, that is the key position where if you don't have people skills and you're not good with emotional intelligence and, coming back with people in a positive way, even in really stressful times, you probably shouldn't be a producer. Um, so I'm not going to say it's not possible, but I tell people a lot of times it's like, you know, uh, as an art lead or a development lead, you can be a good manager, but you don't necessarily have to be a good leader. You should have leadership abilities, but a producer really should have both. Um, and that being said, everybody on the team, and I've been preaching this lately, is everybody on the team, I don't care who you are, needs to have leadership skills to some degree, or you can't function within a team, right? So anyway, I think that kind of answers both questions, like what the differences are and kind of what they are about. I think.
It's some, no, it sums it up pretty well. I think it was also a little bit of a loaded question, but you had a pretty good answer. But on your resume, you've got over 30 titles listed that you've worked on over the years, starting in 1995 all the way, till now nearly. But how have your skills kind of and confidence grown since, starting as a QA person on your first title?
Uh, so I'll just say that a lot of your skills are transferable, and some of those stay, and they always stay relevant. Like we were just talking about people skills, right? Those can only get better. I think as you get older. I know when I was in my early 20s, I was not hard to work with on projects, but I was definitely a little bit more of like a little bit of a know-it-all. And and I wasn't, I was usually right, but I was less like, hey, I'm right and here's why, and more just like, I'm right now, let's do it. And so I think, as you get older, some of those skills develop, like emotional intelligence, and things like that. You work with younger people on teams and you still feel like you're in high school a little bit where they're trying to like learn where their place is on a team and how they talk with people and things like that. So soft skills are something that are always kind of building and growing. But some of those earlier skills, that get outdated, those kind of fall away as you move forward in the industry after years and years. Like if I were to go back right now and pick up, Maya or 3D Studio Max, I'd open it up and be like, well, I can rotate the camera view, and that's about it. I don't think I can make, unless you, sit down and like, okay, well, I can paint a texture, but how do I add it to a model? Like all those kinds of things change with time. So what I would tell people is, with your skills and things like that, if you want to be good at something, stay up to date with the current technology and tools and trends, and always be trying something new. As a producer, I don't necessarily look at a lot of the art tools in great depth anymore, but I'm always looking for new production processes. I'm always looking for new tools that producers would use. How can I create a new dashboard or a new roadmap? Or, I've got my Scrum Master certification a couple of years ago, and I had to renew it. And I remember when I renewed it, I went, uh, That's right. I remember that, but I forgot about it. So you're always kind of like renewing, and reassuring your skills that you're using. And the ones that you don't use, it's like a foreign language. It's like if you are good at a language and you use it, you'll get better at it. But if you don't use it, you kind of forget. But then there's always that back part of your brain, like it's like riding a bicycle. If you pick it up again, you remember.
Yeah.
Um, so, I think with the skills, keep on top of them, never stop researching, watch the YouTube videos often, stay as sharp as you can, because, we talked about earlier where kids are lined up around the block to take your job that are just out of school. And I remember I went into one of my studios one day where I was up for my 1 year review, and we're reviewing it, and they go, well, you got a nearly perfect review, everything is great, you're an awesome team member and things like that, but we can't offer you a raise at this time. And I went, okay, this was one time when I had come out of a really bad uh, death march situation where I had been working my butt off on a salary base. And so you take your salary and you start looking at the hourly rate of that salary. You're not working 40 hours a week, you're working 80. You're working for a lot less, right? And so I remember bringing that up, and I said, hey, I'm working my butt off here, and I think I'm doing a really good job, and I wasn't making a lot. The studio I was at the time couldn't afford a lot. I mean, I think they could have afforded more, but I remember asking for more compensation for my time. And he just kind of looked at me for a second and he goes, I've got kids, and this is exactly what he said. This is why I've said it a couple times. It sticks in my brain. He says, I've got kids lined up around the block to take your job. I could bring them in and pay them way less than what you're getting paid. And I can do it just like that. I can snap my fingers and replace you. And it was just kind of like, wow, I'm respected, but I'm not. He's saying that he can replace me with one, and I'm like, yeah, but you're gonna have to retrain them. And at that point, I was training new artists that were coming in that we were hiring as like an art lead slash instructor. Because like I was saying earlier, you couldn't just watch a YouTube video back then. You had to have it was all internal. And so I was actually teaching a lot of folks that were coming in. And I felt really disrespected and I felt used. And I remember just thinking about that and just going, wow, this industry, even back, in the early 2000s was starting to get aggressive where, you have to keep your tools sharp and you have to be the best, sharpest tool in the shed, for your studio if you want to stick around and make yourself valuable. And that's even more true today. We were talking about earlier with like all this talent pools. So it's an aggressive, there's a lot of industries that are aggressive, but this one definitely you have to keep yourself trained. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that is important. I think I've heard that from a lot of people that I've interviewed. And I think that's really good advice. You've worked with various AAA studios such as Halo Studios, Square Enix, Take-Two. Um, how does the average AAA studio differ from indie studios that you've worked at, such as DSI, which is where we both met and worked at together?
Yeah, so I think with the two different kind of, AAA to studio to indie studio, AAA is it's all managed by, monetary, money, it's large corporations or investors and things like that, where, they set these goals that they want to meet financially, and the project or product that they want to create falls out of that within like a very set schedule and a very tight budget and all that kind of stuff. And so the people on the team are responsible for meeting that budgetary kind of restraint. So it creates like a stress around it, right? Where you have to meet everything in this like criteria of whatever. And if you're working on, a popular franchise or something like that, you have the stresses of making sure that that fan base isn't alienated by this new game or this new work or the way it looks or something like that. So there's a lot of stresses around that. And working in a AAA studio, you have very little say typically, unless you're an like really upper management where you're kind of planning stuff. The rest of the team is just kind of like nose to the ground or nose to the grindstone, and they're just cranking out the work as fast as they can, and doing what they need to do it, and they don't have a lot of creative say. So that can be a little bit disheartening when you're, project after project or whatever, month after month where you're just doing it. And we're happy to make the games, right, in AAA. Halo is fun to work on, Forza and all these kinds of things were great to work on. They're a lot of fun. But, you compare it to an indie studio where, the world is your oyster and the only deadlines typically are the ones that, the team kind of sets or, what can we do? And there's stresses around that, like a lot of indie studios are unfunded, such as DSI, we were unfunded. So our stresses came from, don't quit your day job because you have to pay for rent while you're doing this side thing. And you have a lot more creative control in an indie studio, which is why a lot of us want to make video games. We want to make video games. We want to make them. It's like we want to be heard. We want to be seen. We want to have that creative idea of ours used in something. And that falls on deaf ears in AAA a lot of times. In indie studios, you can have a lot better of a chance of, first of all, it's probably a smaller project. So, the project is maybe 8 months to a year, sometimes longer or sometimes shorter, depending on what it is. But with a AAA studio, you can almost guarantee that product today now they're like 2+ years, where you're doing something on a team of 100 plus people and you're responsible for this one little speck of art over here that, goes with 100 other specks of art. And you don't feel seen even in your own work because it's such a minor role in this greater picture where, indie studios, it's like, oh God, I'm responsible for this entire thing over here that I have to do, the models and the textures and the lighting and all this kind of stuff. And, the other artist, if I have one, is doing something else for, UX UI or all this kind of stuff. And so you have a lot more creative control, but the stress is how do you keep the lights on? And going back to AAA now, with all the layoffs that we've had recently, it's kind of a similar fear where people don't know if they're going to have their job tomorrow. I was looking on LinkedIn earlier today, and some of my friends that I worked with over at 343 on Halo had formed another studio since they got laid off and just found out that studio collapsed. And they seemed like they were doing great. And I just saw, you know, looking for work again, the studio closed, and I just go, gosh, we're doing it all over again. And, our industry right now, whether you're indie or AAA, the tough part is uh, finding something that is solid, where you feel comfortable, like, hey, I'm going to be here next year. I'm going to be here the year after that. You are trained, I think, in college for interview questions. And one of the questions that we typically have been trained to ask is, or we expect to be asked is, where do you see in yourself in 6 months, 1 year, 5 years? And I think for our industry, when you ask somebody, where do you see yourself in a year? You go, I don't know. We'll see. Let alone 5 years, I worked at one of my studios for 7.5 years. And in that 7.5 years, we started as No Wonder. They rebranded as Amaze Entertainment, where No Wonder became one of their studios underneath them with Kryptonite, which I worked in Kryptonite, which was the handheld. Uh, and we had these different departments under Amaze Entertainment. And then after Amaze Entertainment got bought out by, I think it was Glue Mobile. And then around that time, I left, and Glue Mobile was bought out by some other place. And then they ended up shutting that studio down a couple years after I left. But I feel very fortunate that I had a 7-year stint in the industry. I worked at one place for that entire length. And ever since then, before that and after that, it's been a year here, a year and a half there. If you're lucky, you get a year and a half. I think 18 months on Forza. I had exactly 1 year contract at Halo, and I survived the initial layoffs while I was on my contract, only probably because I was on a contract and they didn't want to pay off, the contract if they terminated early. But yeah, the day that contract was over, I was gone and I was part of the layoffs. Um, but yeah, if the hard part in this industry between indie and paid studios is where are you going to be in a year? And indie studios, you could stay at an unfunded indie studio and indefinitely have a hobby. If you have a day job you love and you don't mind working your butt off, on the weekends and in evenings for free because you love making video games, then great. But I don't think anybody in this industry should ever be unpaid Um, but we at DSI, we were trying to get funding, and with the industry the way it is, it's just falling on top of itself right now. So finding funding, we had several projects that we worked on, Connor, while we were there. One of them we only did design doc for, and it was an amazing game that was kind of a treasure hunting, potion makings kind of game that sounded brilliant to me. I thought, hey, if we could get funding for this, our studio is going to take off and we're going to be fine. This is going to be an amazing game. Um, and it got canned. We didn't even do it because we were looking at a year plus, and we couldn't get funding for it. And then the other games that we created a demo for, and we released a couple of other titles. As an indie studio, how do you get eyes on your product? So I think between indie and AAA, you have your marketing, and with AAA, they actually have funding to get their games out there so they can, people know that they exist. With indie studios, you're selling the game to your own team and to your team's friends, and that really is what happened with us. We worked for a very long time on these titles, and we sold very few, very, very few. Like it wasn't even enough to the point where we could even like give bonuses to the team because we didn't make, anything back on them. So indie studios are really tough. You have to find funding, and if you can't find funding, then you're doing it as a hobby. AAA, you're working for the man at the top who dictates everything down to you at the bottom. Your nose is the grindstone. So I'm not trying to sound bitter. I'm just saying that's kind of the way it is,
Well, it's realistic. And even with indie games, I feel like it's highly competitive. I feel like I see somebody opening a new indie studio every day on LinkedIn. And with the Cave Bear program, people are they're working together. They've got like their sister program thing, but still even then like you're still competing with these other studios for eyes. So yeah, it does seem like a very hard industry right now. But something that you had mentioned was with AAA studios, you've kind of got big expectations when working on big franchises. And that was kind of what I was going to ask you next is that, throughout your career, you've worked on some projects that belong to some fairly large franchises like Halo, Dragon Quest. You worked on Chrono Trigger. I think you may have worked on a Final Fantasy. I could be wrong though. But how is it like working on such not noticeable, notable properties that just recognized by name?
It's I I don't use it well. It feels really good. I don't know how to put that in a word.
Yeah.
It feels great, and I wish everybody could have a chance to work on something that, like I look back and I go, wow, I worked on Crash Bandicoot, or whatever, which was a Sony property and things like that, and you look back at your career, and you think, God, I worked on some amazing things. It feels really good. Um, and you just remember a lot of those stories and those things that happened in your career, or on those projects and who you worked with. And things like that. But aside from looking back and because I can go into a game store or a used game store or something, I can see something on the shelf that I worked on, or I hear people talking about it, and and I want to hear it's like what are they saying about the game I worked on, or this property I worked on, I'm just like your ears perk up. And sometimes I feel like, oh, I want to jump in and let them know I did, this on the game, and then I go, well, no, I don't want to be like that person, you know. So there's like a humbleness to it where, you do work on these high things, and when people find out you worked on Chrono Trigger, they want to know everything about it, like what happened in the studio and what stories do you have and blah blah blah. Um, and it feels a little bit like a celebrity syndrome, where you go in and people are kind of like, wow, you're an industry veteran and you've done all these really cool things, Um, and for me, I take it more humbly where, I worked as a volunteer at these Star Trek conventions for several years down in Las Vegas, where I was Patrick Stewart's bodyguard, and I chauffeured Leonard Nimoy and all these different, all these different Star Trek actors. I met all of them, and I worked with them in photo ops booths and things like that year after year, and they'd recognize you and things like that. You'd make sandwiches for them and whatever, just as a volunteer to help out. And you realize that these are all just people. They're They're just regular people that just come in and they're doing their job. And, for me, I think, whether I'm working on, something we did for DSI or whether I did something, high profile, the work is kind of the same as far as I'm making a game, I'm having fun with it. And at the end of the day, what it really comes down to when I think about those stories and I think about those experiences, it comes down to the team that I worked with. And when I work with these people, did I have fun on the project? What stories do I have to tell while I was making this thing? What did I learn from the project? What came out of it? And at the end of the day, it was like, well, was the game successful? Was all that work worth my time? And that's, I think the big question is, the team I worked with, how do we get along? Was it a good experience? What kind of stories do I have? And was it worth our time? Did the game do well? Was it well received? Did it good reviews? Was it hated? You know, and I still remember one of the most exciting moments for me as a developer while I was still young as an artist when Harry Potter came out, the one that I worked on for the very first time in our studio, we were making Harry Potter for the Game Boy Color, the Game Boy Advanced, the PC version, and I think they were doing a console version. So we had four separate teams or three separate teams that were doing different versions of the game in our studio. And I was on the team that was Game Boy Color. So we were like the underdog. Everybody kind of made, little comments about, oh, they're cute. They're a Game Boy Color title, blah, blah, blah. And we just kind of like, whatever, shut up. We're having fun making this game, and, we probably won't sell as many titles as the big console, or the GBA or things like that, but we'll do it. We'll hold our own. And I remember the games they came out and they all came out at the same time, multiple cross-platform different games. And Amazon was still a very new thing in the early 2000s. And, they'd have like the number one best-selling whatever would show up on their main page. And I remember logging in one day, shortly after the game was released, and Harry Potter Game Boy Color was the number one selling item on all of Amazon, entirely, everything. We beat out the console, main console, the PC, we beat out the GBA. The Game Boy Color version of my game that I worked on was number one on Amazon, and it was one of the highest rated games. And I just remember going, wow, as the underdog, uh, we're like, we beat these other teams that were more illustrious, and I felt like this is a great feeling. I feel vindicated for, all this hard work that we put into it. So, you know, when I look back at that and I think about the most recent things that we worked on, as an indie developer at DSI, and other indie developers and things like that, I wish that those folks that are working so hard for free and those folks that are working so hard to build their portfolios can get to a point where if they get lucky enough that they can release something and see it do well and have that emotional feeling of the blood, sweat, and tears that you put into something that you love is well received and sells, or people are playing it, or people are talking about it, when you had fun making the game, at the end of the day, we're making games that should be a fun process, but I also want people to play the game that I work on and enjoy it. And that's, seeing people play it and enjoy it or hear about it and enjoy it is like, wow, as a developer, I did my job. I did a good job. And now people can enjoy what we worked so hard on.
Going back, you mentioned it was kind of like you have a little bit of like a celebrity, or it feels a little bit like a celebrity syndrome, and
Mhm.
I think I'd agree with you, not as somebody that's, I don't have a career in games, but as somebody who's played something that you made, like, I'm a huge Halo fan. You can tell I've got the helmet right there. I've got um, a copy of Halo signed by Steve Downs and Jen Taylor. And so when I got the job, or not the job, but the interview at DSI, and I'd heard that you had worked on Halo Infinite, even, it's just a Halo. I was like, blown away. So yeah, I mean, and it has that effect on people, and I think that, even throughout working at DSI, just the fact that I was able to, like, yeah, I'd tell people, be like, yeah, I worked with this guy and he worked on Halo Infinite, and then my girlfriend's brother, he's huge into games. I'd be like, yeah, he worked on Chrono Trigger. He'd be like, what? Chrono Trigger? So like, yeah, I mean, it's got a, I think, a very profound effect on people that I guess, at least for me, it made me more excited to even just be there. And I just wanted to add that because I thought that was really cool. But in 2018, you kind of took a break from working, and you attended the University of Washington, and you earned a bachelor's in I put education, but it's a business, I think, administration. What motivated you to pursue that degree and take that career break?
Yeah, so I know we were talking earlier about keeping your tool set sharp, and I had been in the industry for a while, so I had industry experience, which was useful, and I had my project management certification that I got at one of the community colleges. I took night classes, and that took me about 6 months to get that little piece of paper. And so I got my job over on Forza as a producer, an art producer, and it was kind of a natural transition. I'd got my certification, and just for the project management, not my bachelor's. And this is back when I started at Forza. Uh, and then after that 18 months, I had that experience as a producer. Um, I moved from Monroe to Federal Way, Washington, bought a house here, and I took a small stint away from the game industry. And during that time when we were selling our house, I was unemployed because we were moving. And I remember getting situated back into the house, and I was like, okay, I'm ready to full on start looking for a job in the industry again. And I'd apply 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 and nothing, nothing, nothing. It was like I might as well just like crunch up my resume and throw it into the wastebasket. Like, you'd apply and nothing. And I go, what is going on? Because I have all this experience. I've been a producer. I have my project management certification. What is happening? Like, why won't anybody hire me? And so I started reaching out to some of these recruiters, and I started reaching out to hiring managers and things like that. And they go, well, things have gotten a little more competitive. So we're really only looking at folks that have a bachelor's degree in some kind of business or some kind of, where they've graduated from something. And I go, well, what about my years of experience? I've been in the industry, for years at this point in time, and I've been in QA and art, and I've done production. Well, what, what do I have to do? And they go, well, and it kept coming back. I had several people tell me, if you had a bachelor's degree, at least in business, they would take you a little more seriously, and it would put you ahead of other people who have them, because of your experience. And I'm like, well, this is really hard because at the time I was already in my early 40s, and I'm like going back or going to college. I didn't even have an associate's. I didn't even have that. I went to the Art Institute of Seattle for a brief time, and I was going to go to DigiPen in the early 2000s, and I got hired for my first role. So I never actually graduated with a computer animation degree or anything like that. I was all self-taught. And so it's like, okay, I don't want to go to school, but I can't get a job. And I sat down one night and I had this conversation with my husband, and he was already kind of paying the bills because we had moved and we were surviving on his income alone. And he says, well, if that's what it's going to take to get you back in the game industry and that's what you love to do, then we'll just buckle down financially for the next 3.5, 4 years, and you can go to school and get your bachelor's degree. And I did. And it was really challenging as an adult, an older adult, middle-aged, whatever, to go back and start from square one. I got my associates. I went to Highline Community College, transferred my credits over to the University of Washington at Milgard, the School of Business, which was great. Um, and I would like to sit here and say, oh, I didn't learn anything. I knew it all going in. It was just like, but I did learn some new skills and it was worth it. And um, I think it was a good experience. And people ask me, it's like, well, what do you think was one of the most impactful things about going to school in your 40s? To get these things. A lot of people that go to school, they're right out of high school in their early 20s, whatever. And I worked with a lot of these students on projects and things like that. And I remember there were probably three different students throughout the years I was there where they were ready to quit. their education. They wanted to leave college and go do something else and just go work. And I said, well, you could do that, but then you'd fall into the trap as to why I'm here, which is to get your bachelor's degree, which is going to help provide you a better future. And so I remember having these conversations, and kind of explaining my situation and explaining where I was. And they'd look at how challenging their current situation was. And I'd say, well, really, what is it challenging? Why is it challenging? And if it was financial, that's understandable. But out of the three that I was speaking with, it was more of like, well, I like to play video games and I just don't get enough sleep. And I'm like, all right, so maybe you could sacrifice video games for your schooling and then just go do something else. Like they weren't necessarily looking to work in the game industry. They would just stay up late and play video games, and like one of them became a lawyer and one of them did some other blah, blah, blah. But I remember it's like being able to be there as an adult or figure or somebody to help guide them and say, stay in school and here's why. And like being an example of here's why made a big difference. And I had one of them actually reach out to me about a year after we had graduated, and she said, I would have quit if you hadn't had me stay or gave me that. And she said, now I've got the job of my dreams. I'm exactly where I want to be. And if I hadn't, I would be working retail somewhere in a job that I did not like. And so she said, I owe it all to you for walking me through that and reminding me why I'm here. And so I was like, man, I went back to school and I got to help other people in their journey and their thing like that. And that felt really good to help, keep people in school and stay focused.
Awesome. I mean, and what I think so interesting about that is that that woman that reached out to you, I imagine she's probably telling that story to other people, saying, "This is why I stayed in. I met this guy Jerry," and that's just, that's just a cool thought to think of. That she might even tell that to if she ever has children down the line who are struggling. So that's cool that you're able to do that to somebody. My next question was going to ask you about some roadblocks or challenges, but you already, I think, tackled that a little bit. But you talked about how you went there to kind of pair your experience with a degree. So far, has that offered any advantages? Has that helped like you thought it would? How's that looking?
Yeah, I think so. Before I went to school, COVID hadn't happened. It was happening actually as I went to school. Um, and COVID was a huge thing where, the industry changed drastically. We went into a growth bubble and then it burst and everything kind of exploded. Um, and looking for work back then was challenging because I didn't have the bachelor's. And then I came out of school and we're in the middle of COVID. And I'm like, well, okay, I'm going to keep looking for work. And I took an extra class on the side through Andy Johnson, who's an amazing producer. He's local here to the Seattle area. I took his production class and I got a certification for game production through him. And I put that on my resume. And I ended up getting, I think, two or three interviews all at once. Boom. And I went, wow, this has never happened before. This is amazing. And I'd had Cami Smith and some other people look at my resume and they go, well, you need to change your resume. And as soon as I changed my resume to what they were talking about, I got all these hits. And it's like a light turned on. And I almost immediately found my job over at 343 Industries. And I thought, wow, I went back to school and I landed my job at Halo. Okay, this is great. It paid for itself. This is amazing. Um, and then the industry went through the bubble. It burst. We went through awful layoffs at Microsoft. Other studios started collapsing. And after I was let go with the downsizing, after my contract ended, I started looking around. And even in that tumultuous time, I was getting a lot of interviews. And I would get to like the end of the interview process where I was like in the top two or three candidates, and I'd be in the final interview. And I remember one of the interviews, I went through a whole team and process interview where I was interviewing the entire day with the entire team, and it was two at a time, and it was 2 hour intervals. And so I went through a 2 hour interval, a 2 hour interval, took a lunch for an hour, did a 2 hour interval. Everything was going amazing. Everybody in the teams were loving me. And then I got to the studio, one of the studio heads, and it was just him and I, and it was like a 1 hour final interview. And he was drunk, high, out of his mind. I don't know what was going on. He was working from home, and his teenage son kept coming in the background to check on him to make sure he was okay. Dad, are you okay? Like he's coming off of some weird thing. And every time I'd say something, he'd go, yeah, 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 yeah. And I'd still be talking. He'd ask me a question, yeah, 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 yeah. And it threw me way off. And it was a horrible experience. And I remember one point I said, "You're kind of making me a little bit nervous. Why am I making you nervous?" And the interview just turned really sour. And I didn't get the job because I think he didn't like the fact that I told him he was making me nervous. But he showed up to this interview just blasted. I don't know what was going on, but it made me really uncomfortable. And I thought, gosh, I don't want to be on a team where this poor team that I interviewed all day long has to deal with this drunk director or whoever is guiding this team. It was just awful. So, I did other interviews one after another. Then I got a job interview, and the day of them signing the paperwork to bring me in, they were closed by the Embracer Group. The Embracer Group closed that studio the day I got the offer letter. So I had hit after hit after hit where I was so close to getting a job right again. And then I just got really frustrated one day, and I remember putting this big post on LinkedIn about, where we are as an industry, and even with my experience, I can't get a job. And I had Nick Revel from DSI reach out to me, and he's like, "Hey, you're talking about you can't find a doorway to walk through. You can't even open a door to walk through. So let's work together." And I said, "Yeah, I'm looking to build the door frame so we can build a door and then we can open it and walk through." And that's when I decided, you know what, I'm just going to work indie for a while, let the job or let the career path for the game industry kind of repair itself. And man, we went through another year and a half of tough times, and who knows where we're going at this point. So, absolutely, I think the bachelor's degree has made a big difference for me, along with, all the experience and time. But ultimately, it just comes down to um, who I think sometimes the situation you're in, the time frame, where you're at. A lot of people are going to be going down to GDC here soon for the 2025 convention. I think that's a great way to meet people and get your foot in the door. We were talking earlier about making those phone calls and just like knocking on a door. I think GDC is kind of the equivalent of that today, where you kind of get a chance to go and do that. I've never been to GDC. Either I'm too busy or can't afford it. Either I'm working or I'm not. So it's hard. I haven't been able to go. But I would recommend if people can go to GDC to try and make some connections while they're down there. But yeah, absolutely. I think the bachelor's degree helps.
Awesome. What advice, I guess, would you give to somebody right now who's, maybe pursuing a degree or working to get experience and pursuing, their dream job in the game industry?
Uh, yeah, have thick skin. Never give up, never surrender. Galaxy Quest's motto is pretty much spot on for us. It's, Hollywood has the saying, "Don't quit your day job." You need to have a backup plan. And just because you're working retail or you're working restaurant or you're working fast food or whatever it is you're doing on the side, that doesn't mean you're a failure. It means you're surviving. And in our industry, it's an entertainment industry. We both have talked about how tough it is. I think a lot of people take it personally when, they go into an interview or they can't even get an interview and they think, what's wrong with me? It's not you. It's just a really tough industry. But what I can say from my own experiences, and I know we've talked about this, you have to continually sharpen your tools. You have to think about yourself as a brand. Who am I and what can I offer is something that but how do you sell that to a hiring manager who knows nothing about you? So always keep in mind, your LinkedIn profile is your brand face for you. So if you look at your profile on LinkedIn and you have a banner behind, your main banner, if it's just a generic banner, what are you saying about you as your brand? So think about your image that represents you and your banner. Think about your connections. How many people are you connected with on LinkedIn? You know, if you're looking for a job in the game industry and you're not connected to every possible studio ever that you could work for, then how do you know when they post a new job posting? How can you interact with those employees and build those relationships on LinkedIn? And if you don't have all those connections, you don't have a network. You need a spider web of network in order to get your name out there, to build your brand, to be noticed, to learn from other people too, and comment on other posts. You know, that's such an important thing that I keep telling people that, you know, they come to me and they say, "Hey, you've been in the industry all this time. What can I do?" I said, "Well, let's pull up your LinkedIn profile. Let's see what's going on. Oh, you've got 30 connections. You've got a generic banner in the background. What are you doing?" You know, so what I tell people is you can say you want to be in the industry, but that doesn't go very far. You have to show people that you want to be in the industry. And I know that I recently hired a producer at one of the studios. I'll just say his name is Carlos Carrera. He's an amazing individual. I highly recommend him as a producer. He doesn't have big industry experience, but he came to me one day and he contacted me on LinkedIn. He said, "I saw your post. I thought it was amazing. Hi, my name is. I want to be in the industry." And I walked him through some of the stuff that we just talked about. And on top of that, I said, "Hey, I show you how to write here. This is hilarious." I said, "You should read this book. It's the Game Production Toolbox by Heather Maxwell Chandler. And you could get a Scrum Master certification. That would help you put you above your competition. You know, since you can't get a job in the industry without experience and you can't get experience without experience, blah, blah, blah. Build your tool set." So he went off and I didn't hear from him for about 6 weeks. And I noticed one day on LinkedIn, he had gotten his Scrum Master certification. And I replied to that and I said, "Wow, congratulations. That's amazing. You followed that and you were able to do that kind of thing." And he goes, "Yeah." And I got that book and I read it cover to cover and I love it. Um, and I said, "That's the difference between saying you want to be in the industry and wanting to really show that you're going to be in the industry." And I said, "Well, I need help over at DSI. There's a lot of work that we have to do." And having had these conversations with him, I knew that he had a high amount of emotional intelligence. I knew that he was a people person. And I said, "You're somebody that I think I could work with. And you are motivated," which is a huge piece of it. And I brought him in. We started working together. I helped training him with stuff. He was picking it up. He was, researching things on his own. He was going out and doing it. And that is the kind of, I guess, mentality that if you're going to work in the game industry, you have to have. You know, and Connor, you're doing these kinds of interviews with folks, learning about different things. That's great extraterrestrial. It's extracurricular on your side to learn more. You know, it's the difference between saying I want to be in the industry and showing you want to be in the industry. And I think for everybody who, you know, is saying they want to be in the industry, if they reflect back and they really want to be in the industry, what are they doing every day or every week to make that goal happen? And I've worked with people at DSI, and I ask them, like, "What are you doing right now to build your portfolio or to build your tools?" And they go, "Well, I'm working here." And I go, "You need more. You always have to do more." And, what are you doing? If you're a writer, and you've written nothing but romance type stuff, but you're a really good romance writer, but you're trying to get a job at Halo, what are you going to show the people at Halo, your romance novel, Or so it was a conversation about diversifying your portfolio. And if you're an artist, can you show space? Can you show Western? Can you show all these different, you know, genres? Because in the game industry, we're working with witches and wizards one minute and then working with aliens the next. So if you have a portfolio of work, can your portfolio of work demonstrate that you can do a cozy game and a first-person shooter? And maybe you only want to work on one thing, but that doesn't mean you're going to get that job. You have to be really diverse and you have to be good at everything. So if your portfolio is showing a crappy Western town that you didn't do very good at, but your sci-fi looks really good, that hiring manager is still going to go, "Well, our next project, we haven't told you this, is going to be a Western, but your Western stuff doesn't look very good." So you really got to be the best at what you do. You always got to be improving those skills. Keep those, that tool belt, your bat belt. We used to call it the bat belt. Keep your bat belt sharp, with all
Yeah.
its and that's what I would tell people, you've got to stay on top of it. You've got to be the best in your game and you never stop learning. I'm looking at taking another course right now, just on production stuff, just to continue to brush up and continue to do things. So, we're always learning, no matter who we are, where we are, how many years we've been in the industry, there's always something new to learn.
First of all, great advice. You're right, and that's I think what you said about keeping your tools up to date and kind of making sure that you're doing things to showcase your skills. I've heard that from a lot of people, and I think that that rings true, especially for this industry more than anything. But I usually have blind rankings that I have people do. Unfortunately, we're running low on time, so I'm going to cut them. Maybe we can do them another time. But I've only got two more questions here for you, and they should be fairly short. Um, First of all, and I ask this to everybody, and everybody acts like it's a trick question, but well, what's your favorite video game of all time?
Um, hmm, yeah, it's tough. I have a lot of favorites. I would probably say Final Fantasy IX or yeah, I'll just stick with that. Let's say Final
Final
Fantasy
Fantasy IX.
IX.
All right, awesome. I'm trying to think of which one that is. I'll think about it another time. And then last question is there anything else you'd like to add before, we head off here?
Um, I think just the note about the industry in general, all the things we've talked about, it's an ever-changing space. It can be good one minute, it can be bad the next. I would tell people, hang in there. Don't let it negatively depress you. There are bad people in the industry, there are good people in the industry. They're all going to affect you at some point in a different way. Um, but you have to have tough skin and emotional intelligence and to get through it. So it's not just keeping your tools sharp, but it's not letting all the negativity around you bring you down. And then the other thing is find a community if you don't have one in the game industry. Find people that you collaborate with. Join some game jams, make some friends that you collaborate with. Get on Discord. If you feel alone, or you don't have that supporter network, find other people that complement your weaknesses and try and learn from them. If you're an artist, find a developer or a coder, somebody that can learn from you and you can learn from them. I know one thing is an artist, I typically would kind of stay to the other artists, but that was really limiting my view on what the whole industry was kind of about. So don't limit yourself to other people like yourself. Get out there and learn about audio folks and writers and all those different kinds of things and expand your vision of what the game industry as a whole is really about. And that'll help you understand more about how the games work and function and the production processes, how they work. And it'll only make you better at what you do, so you know how to approach all those other different areas within the game industry.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Jerry. Thank you for, agreeing to do this. I really appreciated our talk.
Yeah, me too, for sure. And who knows, maybe next time it'll be 2.0. We'll talk about something else.
Yeah, maybe. All right. Thanks, Jerry.
All right. Thanks, Connor.
All right.
Bye.